here we turn to the question, has the other side won? Running a think tank can be easily defined. We find brilliant men and women with brilliant ideas, which we then promote to our political friends. But if these ideas are to be put into action, at least quickly, it helps to have the right politicians in office. Hence this session. Fraser, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Well, it's, first of all, thank you all for coming. Normally, this is the session where everybody slinks off to the pub, so I'm impressed how many of you have turned down the attractions of our many nice pubs around here. Now, has the other side won? A kind of grim question, but the last time governments ran into the sands in the late 1970s, Conservatives were actually ready. There was an intellectual momentum behind Margaret Thatcher when she took power in 1979. There was an intellectual counter-revolution, which was started, of course, by the Centre for Policy Studies, had its counterpart in America, and it found in Reagan and Thatcher two radicals, two fighters who were able to implement that solution. This time around, when governments hit the sands, it's not entirely clear that Conservatives are ready. It's quite a popular idea that capitalism somehow dysfunctions and that government with its stimuli is the solution. There were two countries that didn't quite do so badly, Canada and Australia. And I'm delighted to be joined by one minister, one former prime minister from them tonight, as well as my colleague from The Spectator, Toby Young. Now, John Howard has had 4 terms as Prime Minister of Australia, but oversaw the largest economic expansion, cultural renaissance, school choice, foreign policy success, and he ran the country so well that when the crash came, it was pretty difficult to knock it off course, leaving, of course, the opposition to take much of the credit. Jason Kennedy is Canada's Minister for Employment and Multiculturalism. They sound an incongruous combination, until you remember that Canada is doing this incredibly well. Canada is absorbing more immigrants than pretty much any developed country in the world, and that is going well. Now, conservatism struggles to get votes and support amongst ethnic minorities, even though their values tend to be essentially conservative. But thanks to Jason's work, the Conservatives in Canada now get more support from ethnic minorities than the ethnic population. I'm not sure that's true anywhere else. One of the many tricks up his sleeve. Now, Toby Young is, amongst many things, a Spectator writer, but more than that, he is also a fighter who doesn't just write about declining standards in education, but went to set up a free school, which he's done in the west of London. And he is so talented a journalist, I can let you into a secret. As his editor, I have seen today, we went to press this afternoon, Toby has already written a brilliant column about the session we're about to go through. It reads so well. I can't tell you what a treat you're all in for. And he didn't even need to sit through the session to do it. That is a mark of a truly great journalist, ladies and gentlemen. So, let's start off, if we can, with John Howard. Has the other side won, or can liberty and popular capitalism fight back?
Well, thank you very much, Fraser. I guess it depends a lot on how you define that question and that proposition. If I can look at the philosophy of what followed the global financial crisis, it's fair to say that capitalism and financial institutions got more blame than they deserved, or perhaps put it another way, there was far too little blame attached to the profligate behaviour of legislators in the United States who flung money at people who had no capacity to repay housing loans. If you look at the original cause of the subprime meltdown in the United States, it was due to the fact that lending practices became increasingly loose. For social and political reasons, lenders, including government-controlled ones such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, gave people loans that they had no capacity to repay. Those loans were then packaged up and securitised and sent off and completely forgotten, and then turned out to be very toxic in the hands of people who'd acquired them. And because the United States has non-recourse loans when it comes to housing, unlike the UK and Australia. I was interested in David Petraeus's comment earlier, where he contrasted the rather more effective American system of giving mineral rights to the landowner, whereas in Australia and the United Kingdom the mineral rights remain with the Crown, and he saw that as a benefit, and I think he's right in that context. But I think in relation to non-recourse loan making when it comes to housing, I think the American system was one of the reasons why the subprime crisis became so toxic. The point I'm making is that the retrospective on the global financial crisis is that it was all the fault of the greedy financial institutions. Now, I'm sure some of them were greedy, and I'm sure they made mistakes, and many of them deserved some of the financial costs that they suffered. But equally, it's true to say that the original cause of the subprime meltdown was the fact that far too many borrowers in the United States were given loans that they had no hope of repaying, and those loans were given to them as a result of misguided housing policies followed by legislators who falsely believe that if you want to help somebody buy a house, the best way of doing it is to give them a loan they can't afford to repay, rather than directly subsidising them to do it, or alternatively perhaps subsidising their capacity to pay rent for accommodation. So I do think one of the lessons out of the global financial crisis was that, if you can put it loosely like this, our side was very poor at fixing the blame on the interventionist behaviour of legislators and loan providers and government agencies in the United States. And as a result of that, capitalism has got a badder rap, and I don't mind describing it as just capitalism in a term, because it's a term we all understand, and that has perhaps created the impression that the global financial crisis was more a setback for market economics and for our side of the argument than in fact it really was. If you go a little broader with the definition and you talk about the progress of liberty and freedom, which were the generic descriptions of what Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and others at the time really stood for, I think the field evidence is very mixed. There's no doubt there's been a regression in Eastern Europe. The hopes that many people had about the Russian Federation have not been realised. We've talked earlier about the Middle East. In the Asian part of the world, the field evidence is mixed. The most outstanding success story on the freedom front in Asia, of course, is Indonesia. When I became Prime Minister of Australia in March of 1996, Indonesia was still ruled by General Suharto, the military dictator, who'd been in power since 1965. Then, through a series of presidents and constitutional changes, it's fair to say that by 2004, Indonesia had morphed into a genuine democracy. A lot of corruption in the country, a lot of flaws, a lot you can criticise, but it is still fair to describe Indonesia as the third largest democracy in the world. It's a country that is often ignored in analysis by Americans and Europeans, I find, and there's not perhaps the understanding there ought to be of what that country has achieved. To go from military dictatorship, and it is the largest Islamic country in the world, to go from military dictatorship to democracy in that period of time and to hang on to it. Indonesia has had for the last 8 years a very pro-Western president a moderate Islamic leader who abhors Islamic terrorism as much as anybody in this room does. He occupies a very important position, and his term's coming to an end, and Indonesia will elect a new president in the next few months. So that's a real plus for freedom, because by any measurement, for the largest Islamic country in the world in the space of less than 10 years to transition from a military dictatorship, albeit an anti-communist, pro-Western military dictatorship, but a military dictatorship nonetheless, to a genuine democracy with all the flaws that it may nonetheless have, is quite an achievement. Now that is, that's on the plus side. On the minus side, you have a country like Thailand. And indeed, only in the last week, my wife and I had an extraordinary experience in Beijing. We had dinner with a group of people that included some very significant people from Thailand. I'll just leave it at that description. And naturally, the subject of the military coup in Thailand came up. And to a last man and woman, this Thai group were saying how good the coup was. Because it had restored order and stability to the country. And Jeanette and I were presumptuous enough to say, well, this is the second or third time that a properly elected government has been replaced by a military government. And the reply to our observation was, oh, well, that government bought its way into office. In other words, it offered financial inducements to people to vote for them, in the sense not of direct payments, but rather policies that were very attractive to the poorer people of that country. Now, Thailand has had its share of corruption and still does, as many countries around the world do, but the fundamental truth is that over the last 10 years, on two occasions, a duly elected government, and certainly led by a brother first and then a sister successively, and people who were very controversial and have been convicted and by certain processes, or certainly in the case of the brother of Thaksin Shinawatra, they have been removed from office. And what I must say I found disturbing about this discussion was the almost, well, not relaxed, but measured acceptance that it was necessary in the broader interest to remove a government that, for all its flaws, had been properly elected by the people. And Thailand's a country that Australia's had a lot to do with. When I was in office, I negotiated a free trade agreement between Australia and Thailand. I dealt very extensively with Thaksin Shinawatra. I'm not offering a view about some of the allegations that are made against him. I dealt with a lot of people against whom allegations had been made in the time that I was in government, and that comes with the territory. But it seemed to me that this was a case of the elite of a country deciding that they really knew better than the less well-educated, more ignorant people in the community, and it was a form of indifference to democratic process that I found disturbing. The last thing I want to say by way of introduction is perhaps to reinforce something that I observed in the earlier session, and I'm sorry you've sort of had back-on-back contributions from me, but and that is this issue of cultural self-belief. I have a very strong view that part of the problem that we've had in the last 10 years, and perhaps part of the problem, one of the reasons why we're even talking about has the other side won, is that we have not exhibited, countries like Australia and Britain and the United States and Canada and others, for all that we should feel gratified about the many good things. We haven't always been good enough at articulating in a positive way the intrinsic values of our civilisation and what such concepts as liberty and freedom and parliamentary democracy and the rule of law, the benefits that they bring, and that they are inherent values in their own right. They're not things that you can temporise about, that they're not relative concepts, they're absolute concepts. They've got imperfections. And as I observed earlier, both Thatcher and Reagan were uncompromising in their beliefs that Western civilisation and liberal values, properly described, were the best way to go and were the foundations of a proper society. And much of the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions were calling the people of Britain and the United States back to those inherent values. And as we face extremism, certainly of the Islamic kind, but sometimes of other kinds, the most effective weapon is not to suggest almost that on occasions, well, maybe the extremists have got a point, but rather to reassert the fundamental values of our own culture. And cultural self-belief is something that we need to understand, we need to demonstrate, and it remains, without doubt, in my opinion, the best weapon in dealing with extremism and the best weapon of reinforcing the values that this conference is all about.
Thank you, John. Now, while you were listening, please do think of questions which you can pose to our panel via the iPads, which you will have under your chair or sneakily in your handbags or something. And so we'll do the questions after the end of the session. Now, Jason, I forgot to say, on Monday, Jason Kenney received the inaugural Disraeli Award from Policy Exchange. So he is a garlanded Canadian Minister for Jobs and Employment and Multiculturalism. So Jason, tell us whether liberty and popular capitalism can fight back.
Yes, it can, and has the other side won? No. Let me first of all say what an honor it is to be here in bringing new relevance to the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, especially on a panel with my Commonwealth cousin, one of the great modern conservative heads of government of our time, John Howard. And yes, so I would argue that the other side has not won, and that we not only can fight back, but have very effectively in many parts of the world. First of all, John spoke about sort of a global perspective, and there are many comments throughout sessions earlier today that have pointed out that the world is freer and more prosperous than it's ever been, thanks to the organic growth of popular capitalism throughout the developed world. And just one incredibly positive proof point is the recent massive mandate given to Narendra Modi in what was the world history's largest election. And of course, Indian politics is incredibly complex, but Narendra Modi demonstrated in his decade of leadership as chief minister in Gujarat the application of the core principles of democratic capitalism, the rule of law, combated corruption, created a credible redress for violated contracts, created confidence and trust in the Gujarati economy that attracted the kind of investment that India needs, and through which it can elevate hundreds of millions of people from poverty to the status of the middle class. So just to take that one brilliant example of the world's largest democracy, we hope now with a focused, energetic, principled, pro-market government on the road to prosperity. To comment perhaps on my own experience in Canada, I just want to cast my mind back a bit. Just a little over 2 decades ago, I was helping to start an organization called the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, like Britain's Taxpayers Alliance. And my boss, Prime Minister Harper, was helping to start a new upstart populist conservative party called the Reform Party to challenge Canada's tired political establishment at the time. And there's a reason why these movements began 25 years ago in Canada. It's because there had been a sort of center-left consensus across the partisan spectrum that had led to ever-expanding growth in the size of the state, that led to tax fatigue as taxes as a share of GDP were reaching 50% and beyond, as governments spiraled ever downward into deficits and greater debt, driving up in those days interest rates, Inflation was a challenge, degrading people's savings and their standard of living. Much of this was the legacy of the center-left social democratic government of Pierre Trudeau during 14 years, our version of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter only went on for 4 years, Pierre Trudeau went on for 14. He could do a lot more damage to the fundamentals of our economy. There was a, quotes, progressive conservative government of the Progressive Conservative Party under Brian Mulroney between 1984 and 93 that, to its credit, sought to undo some of the more egregious structural problems in the Canadian economy and undo some of the terrible record of the Social Democrat Trudeau administration, but wasn't nearly ambitious enough and missed the opportunity that Margaret Thatcher created in Britain through her power of persuasion and her depth of conviction. In fact, she once commented that the progressive conservatives in Canada put rather too much emphasis on the adjective as opposed to the noun. And that is why we had a rupture in the conservative movement in Canada between the progressive and the conservative. That is what Stephen Harper and I were doing 25 years ago in different ways at the same time. So fast forward to now, we've been in office, the newly formed Conservative Party of Canada, which is the outgrowth of a merger of that populist upstart movement and the old PCs, that brought to office a lot of conviction conservatives who were inspired by the example of Margaret Thatcher. So we've been in office for 8 years, and we've managed to cut taxes 160 times. We've cut taxes as a share of GDP at the federal level in Canada to their lowest level since 1964. We've cut business taxes to their lowest level, to be the lowest in the G7, amongst the lowest in the developed world. Bloomberg and Forbes have said at various times in the past few years that Canada is the best country in the world in which to make new investments and start a new business because of this partly because of this new tax environment. We have low inflation. We have one of the lowest levels of public indebtedness, at least at the federal level, in the developed world. We have been cutting regulation. We've been aggressively pursuing a free trade agenda. When we came to office, Canada had free trade agreements with 4 jurisdictions, and now we have free trade agreements either ratified or signed in principle with 45 jurisdictions and about another 20 that we are negotiating. Hugely important for us parenthetically because it reduces our dependence on the United States, which sideswiped us with the global downturn. Balanced budgets have gone from, deficits have gone from being conventional wisdom in Canadian politics 2 decades ago to verboten in the public discourse now. Governments of all stripes used to raise taxes mindlessly and pay very little in terms of a political consequence 2 decades ago. In Canada now, social democratic parties in Canada talk about cutting taxes. The price of admission into the electoral politics in Canada now is essentially fiscal responsibility and moderation on tax rates. And as a result of all of this, none other than that conservative house organ, the New York Times, recently concluded in a major study they did with the Economic Institute in Europe that Canada now has the wealthiest middle class in the world, the highest median incomes in the developed world. With apologies to Australia, John, we know that your successor, Tony, will get in the race with us. And so this is the good news, that not only have we achieved this growing opportunity for freedom, for popular capitalism in the economy through moderate spending restraint and all of these other policies, but we've also managed to move the pendulum significantly towards more balance in the criminal justice system. It had swung clearly too far in the other direction, focused on procedural rights of criminals as opposed to the substantial right of safety for law-abiding citizens. We've rebuilt our military. We have asserted a very clear and principled foreign policy grounded in our democratic values. With respect to John's imperative of cultural self-belief, we have sought to restore understanding and pride in our historically grounded national values and institutions and traditions. We did that, for example, by massively reforming our citizenship program to increase civic literacy and literacy in one of our 2 official languages. And finally, we have done much of this in part by seeing immigration properly managed as an advantage for economic growth, for innovation, for the advancement of popular capitalism. We did this in part because it's our observation, and the data demonstrates that the natural populist capitalists, the natural entrepreneurs and innovators in our economy and in much of the developed world are newcomers. They're immigrants who are, at least in North America, twice as likely as native-born North Americans to start new businesses, small businesses, where they personify precisely the virtues that Margaret Thatcher tried to inculcate here, moving earners to owners. People with people with a work ethic that would put Max Weber and his European Protestants to shame. People who come to Canada and they'll take 2 or 3 survival jobs to save up the money to start the small business. And what ultimately the way that we as democratic capitalists, as conservatives, as people of the center-right can win and can fight back is by expanding our coalition, just as Margaret Thatcher did with the aspirational class, with the tradesmen, with home ownership. And that is precisely what we've done with immigrant communities in Canada. We have been, as you've said, Fraser, maintaining one of the highest per capita levels of immigration in the developed world. We do seek to select people based on their human capital, not people who seek to benefit from the welfare state, but rather to pursue economic opportunity through hard work and entrepreneurship, and who are therefore naturally distrustful of confiscatory levels of taxation and wealth-destroying regulation. And in doing this, not only have we helped to contribute to our national wealth, by the way, it's worth noting that based on research done by Vivek Vadva and others in the United States, we believe this is true in Canada, immigrants are massively more likely to register patents and be involved in technological innovation. So much of the IT industry in the United States is driven by brilliant new Americans, just as our innovation in Canada is driven by newcomers. Not only have we made this an economic virtue, but we've also made it a political virtue. And indeed, in the last election, after years of very determined work, the Conservative Party won a substantially higher share of the vote of immigrants than any other party, about 20 points more, and a substantially higher share of the vote of immigrants than we did amongst native-born Canadians. I believe we're the only center-right party in the world to have done so. And this is, I offer this as a point of hope. I believe that this is very much in keeping with the spirit of Margaret Thatcher. I think she understood, and would understand in countries that are increasingly dependent on immigration to deal with the demographic crisis, that this is a huge and natural opportunity. And finally, we did this. We did this not through some kind of cynical pandering or Tammany Hall politics. We did it by connecting with people in the most honest way you can in politics, which is by getting them to vote their values. It's a big challenge. It's much harder to do it than to say it, but we've managed to achieve that, and as a result, I believe that we are winning the war for freedom and popular capitalism in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Uplifting report from Canada. Toby, tell us what's to be uplifting about in Britain.
I just wanted to preface my remarks by saying what a huge honor it is to share a panel with a man who has done so much to advance the cause of conservatism around the world, and it was given, I'm sure, every one of us in this room hope. I speak, of course, of my boss, Fraser Nelson. Thank you, Fraser.
You pay rise in the post, Toby, don't worry.
No, in all seriousness, John Howard, Jason, it's a great honor. I don't think the other side has won, but I do think that we're probably on a stickier wicket than we have been for some time. I think partly as a result of the work done by the CPS, by Sir Keith Joseph, and by Margaret Thatcher, the battle of ideas was won in the late 70s and early 80s, and politics in Britain and elsewhere was reshaped by that intellectual victory. But I think we're now on the back foot, and we do have to fight that battle all over again. I think one of the forms that battle took in the late 70s and early 80s was to champion liberty over equality. That was the great battle, and one of the things that enabled our side to win that battle is because the exponents of the equality principle seem to have the blood of tens of millions of people on their hands in China and the Soviet Union and elsewhere. But that principle, the principle of equality, has made a comeback, and I think that is what is currently threatening liberty and popular capitalism. We can see this in the huge attention garnered by the work of Thomas Piketty, by Joseph Stiglitz and others. They've somehow promoted this idea very successfully that there is a fundamental antagonism between free market capitalism and equality, and that unbridled market forces inevitably lead to grotesque extremes of inequality, which in turn lead to social dislocation and upheaval. And I think the way to win this battle is not to restate the case for liberty, but to carry out a kind of form of ideological jiu-jitsu and capture the equality principle from the other side and claim it for ourselves. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in the case of the canard that popular capitalism inevitably leads to greater and greater inequality, let's expose that for the lie that it is. A few examples in this country. Since David Cameron became Prime Minister, there's the rather awkward fact that the Gini coefficient has actually fallen. It hasn't increased. Income inequality is now lower than it was 4 years ago after 13 years of Labour in power. Yes, there's been a small increase in income inequality in the United Kingdom over the past 30 years, but that's nothing to do with unbridled market forces. That's to do with policy choices made by successive governments, such as granting pensioners tax breaks. But if you look at the global picture, global inequality over the past 40 years or so has declined dramatically, as we've seen different regions of the world benefit from the free enterprise system. There was a fantastic graph, a chart published by the American Enterprise Institute last year, which showed that between 1970 and 2006, the percentage of the world's population living in poverty declined from 26.8% to 5.4%. That's an 80% reduction in global poverty in 36 years. Why? Because the benefits of capitalism have been extended to regions such as Africa, East Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. There isn't a conflict between the equality principle and the free enterprise system. The two go hand in hand. I think one of the ways, another way in which we can try and capture that ground from our opponents is to champion the principle even more aggressively than we already do of equality of opportunity. One of the things that endangers the cause of popular capitalism is the feeling that not everyone can share, not everyone can participate in the benefits of the capitalist system. If you're born poor, you remain poor because our education systems simply aren't fit for purpose. So we absolutely have to support, we have to defend the education reform program that Michael Gove has so successfully piloted and introduced in this country. We can't begin to turn our back on that program of reforms as it hits a few bumps in the road. We have to stay steadfast and true to the principle of equality of opportunity and support what Michael Gove and others are doing to try and improve equality of opportunity, improve the opportunities our public education system provides for children of ordinary people. I think the third way in which our side can claim the equality principle is by standing up even more than we do already for equal rights. The left has surrendered free speech to those of us on the centre-right. We saw this in the Leveson affair. In the 1960s and 1970s, the cause of free speech was very much a left-wing cause associated with various underground magazines and various causes and groups and so on and so forth. They've surrendered that territory to us. I don't think it'll take too much to persuade them to surrender the principle of equal rights to us too. The left, we saw over the Trojan horse scandal in Birmingham, is extremely inhibited about criticizing Muslim extremists, about ignoring the rights of women, flagrantly abusing homosexuals and so on and so forth. Where were the left-wing feminist voices standing up for the girls in those schools who are made to sit at the back of the class because they're considered second-class citizens whose education isn't as important as the education of boys by those groups? Where were those voices on the left? The only voice sticking up for those girls in the public arena was the voice of our own education secretary.
They cut you off.
Sorry?
Cut you off.
My microphone's off, is it?
Trojan
Back
horse.
on.
Back on. Okay.
Too much emotion for the system there, Toby.
Sorry, I'll stand a little bit further back. Getting too worked up here. But we can see that the left is very quick to highlight the abuse of Palestinians in Israel, but ignores the fact that there are human rights abuses in other Middle Eastern regions. What about the rights of the Kurds in Iraq? What about the rights of Coptic Christians in Egypt? What about the rights of women in Saudi Arabia? Then they're very inhibited about standing up for equal rights in these territories for fear of being branded Islamophobic, as though they'll be betraying the principle of multiculturalism. I think we have to take advantage of that timidity and claim this territory for ourselves. We have to stand up for the rights of religious minorities, but not turn a blind eye if those minorities ignore the rights of women, or the rights of homosexuals, or the rights of those who don't share their religious faiths. I think we have to allow faith groups to educate their children in accordance with their faith, but not to denigrate the values that have made that freedom that they enjoy possible, such as individual liberty, the rule of law, and equal rights. So let us not just become the champions of liberty, let us become the champions of equality too. You don't have to be anti-equality to be pro-market. You don't have to be anti-capitalist if you're pro-equality. The great thing about the free enterprise system, and this is the case we need to make if the other side is not to emerge triumphant from this new battle of ideas, the great thing about free markets is that they can deliver both freedom and equality.
Thanks very much, Toby. So I've got your questions, some of them in by the iPad. Do keep them coming. One did jump out at me, and it's something I could put to all three of you. I mean, all of you spoke about, well, John, you're speaking about the encouraging democratic trends in the East. And Toby, you're talking about the way that global poverty is collapsing. But the number one driver of the collapse in this global poverty has been the progress in China. And China, does it not, pose rather a difficult question, because we would like to believe that liberty is the surest route to prosperity. And 25 years ago, when the wall was coming down, it would seem impossible to believe that Canada would be going up by some measures the number one global economy. So has Canada's success, China's success not posed us a problem when it comes to arguing that liberty is self-evidently the best way ahead? John?
Well, no, I don't think it proves that at all, because as a wise man once said, everything is relative, and there is relatively more liberty, economic liberty in China now than there was before Deng Xiaoping in 1978 declared that China was going to become a market economy. And more than 50% of GDP in China now is in private hands. Now that is a manifestation of liberty. It's not a manifestation of state ownership. I mean, if you want evidence of where liberty doesn't enrich people, the collapse of the command economies in Eastern Europe that were part and parcel of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So my response to that is no, it doesn't disprove the proposition at all. The other shoe has yet to drop in China, and the other shoe is political liberty. And I said in the earlier session that as the years go by, it will be increasingly difficult for the Chinese to maintain this dichotomy. You practice market economy, but you still tell people what to believe and what to do politically. I think that is unsustainable, and it will certainly be unsustainable to the Chinese who are born into middle-class affluence. They will demand their political rights, and I think the other shoe will then drop. When that drops, I don't know, but it will drop.
Right. And Jason, a question for you. Given all the successes that you were outlining that the Canadian government has done, how come you guys look like you're probably going to lose the next election if it's so popular?
Well, I wouldn't accept the premise of the question.
Good on you.
We've been in office for 9 years. Any government that's been in office for 9 years is going to have a challenge to get its mandate renewed, because we all know that in modern democratic politics, the clock ticks and the generic desire for change moves up. But fundamentally, with all of those things I described about our economic soundness, we're confident about our chances for re-election. But look at it this way. For 76 of the years of the 20th century, Canada was governed by the Liberal Party of Canada. And in the last election, they had their worst result in history, down to 30 seats, and they are no longer the dominant default party of government. Stephen Harper's vision was to make the Conservative Party, yes, a principled party, but very much in the mainstream of our political culture. We've moved that political culture in our direction. We defined the terms of the debate. In the next year, we're going to have a surplus that will allow us to further cut taxes, demonstrating to people in a very practical way the benefit of fiscal responsibility and a focused government. So with that, together with the kind of structural advantage we now have in the electorate, with new Canadians who constitute 20% of our electorate, plus redistribution that reflects growth of the population in regions of the country where people are more prone to vote for center-right parties, we're very optimistic. But again, what's fundamentally different is that in the past, I would argue that the Progressive Conservative Party was an echo of the centrist, center-left Liberal Party, and it was there sort of every 15 years to replace them for the momentary timeout, for the interregnum. Now we have a competitive political system in Canada where conservatives are defining the terms of the debate, and that is a massive advantage.
And John, isn't this a problem, though, for successful governments in general? Take the Swedish government. Their Conservatives have done very well. They've survived the crash very well. And yet the country feels, well, we're not on the edge anymore. Things are relatively prosperous. And that's when you start to think you can afford to take a risk. There's a paradox of success, isn't there?
I'm familiar with the phenomenon.
Well, you fended it off pretty
well.
well.
I mean, but the reality is that after you've been in office for a long time, and let me assure Jason that 8 or 9 years is not as long as almost 12. So, which we had. And after a while, people do think they can afford a change. We had research that was done in 2007, the year that we lost the election, which suggested that the Australian people thought that the prosperity of Australia was largely due to our situation in the world, and that and impliedly it didn't really matter too much who was governing the country. They could afford, in other words, to take a risk at a change of government, and this bloke's been in for almost 12 years and he hasn't done a bad job, but maybe it's time for a change. Now, that is a phenomenon of democratic politics, and it's a phenomenon that faces all of us. It's just the nature of men and women in affluent democracies. I mean, we're talking about somebody today who we all revere, but remember, her party tipped her out because they thought she couldn't win. I mean, that's the reality in democracies. So I suppose what that tells you is that while you're there, you've got to use all of your time to do good things because you're not there forever. That applies to all of us.
There's another question here. Jason Kenney said that the Canadian Progressive Party was not ambitious enough. Is today's British Conservative Party ambitious enough?
There you go. Sure.
I knew you guys were going to do that. So.
Is it ambitious enough? Well, I think wanting to, well, in some respects, it was too ambitious with the program it announced at the beginning of the coalition, which was to reduce the deficit to zero in 5 years. Yeah. Clearly, far too ambitious a target, it turns out, in retrospect. I think that certainly lots of people on the right complain that David Cameron has made too many compromises with Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats, and the government isn't as blue as it could be. I think the realities of politics are that it would have been difficult for the Conservatives to pursue a more radical agenda than they have done. I think where they focus their fire, and you have to pick your battles in education, in welfare, to a certain extent local government, they have been pretty effective. And I think they've given the British public a taste of what they could do if they were untrammeled by the Lib Dems. But who knows if the electorate will respond to that.
Okay. Right, do keep thinking of questions and emailing them through. I've got one now here saying, immigration is a split. Immigration is split to the right in Britain and in America. Can you be pro-liberty but anti-free movement of people? This is from Ryan Bourne. I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, like it depends on what your starting point is. If your starting point is that every country has the right to decide who comes to live in the country and the circumstances in which they come, then there's no incompatibility. And I think it is fundamental to the sovereignty of a nation state that it should have the right to decide who comes to live in the country. I respect the fact that this is a live issue in Britain because Britain no longer controls her borders because of the membership of the European Union. I understand that, and I don't envy the task that the British government has in dealing with this issue, but I see no incompatibility between liberty and the right of the nation state, because the key organising political unit of the world is still the nation state. Unless you have a state of affairs where a government is immediately responsible to and accountable to the people who choose it, you don't really have a functioning political unit. So once you accept that proposition, then part and parcel of that sovereignty is the right to decide who comes to live. Now, obviously, it's in the interest of a country to choose people on the basis of the contribution they make, and it's in the interest of all countries to adopt an open policy towards immigration, but they've got to have the right to decide who comes and the circumstances in which they come, and I don't see any incompatibility between that and freedom.
I agree entirely, and let's define our terms. I don't think many people in this room at this conference define liberty as the night watchman state, Randian kind of liberty. The Wall Street Journal editorial board would have open borders. I don't think many mainstream conservatives think that's plausible, and I think what the broad tradition that most of us here represent is one of ordered liberty, and we support ordered immigration, orderly immigration. I agree entirely with John. One obvious expression of the national sovereignty is control over a nation's borders. But I think, like John, like Australia and Canada have both demonstrated, immigration is in a country's interest, economic and cultural interest, to avoid stagnation, to grow, to innovate. and to integrate newcomers.
But just on the right, I mean, you talk about how Canada's got more immigrants, accepts more than any other Western country, almost like a badge of pride. I mean, do you not get critics on the right saying, look, simply, there are too many people here? I mean, David Cameron's immigration policy isn't one of quality, it's about one of numbers. He wants to halve the number.
Because he doesn't control it. And because of the membership of the European Union, he has... I mean, if you control... Can I just say that my experience was that once the Australian public felt that our immigration policy was properly controlled, public support for immigration rose. And when they thought it was out of control, public support for immigration fell. And I'm sure
That's exactly our experience.
I'm sure that would be the experience in Canada. And it's the reaction of the public is to this sense of control and order.
Exactly.
They really want control and order, and then they'll go along with it because it's a tradition of our societies to attract people from around the world, providing they become part of our community.
So exactly, and to answer your question, Fraser, maintaining relatively high levels of immigration hasn't been terribly contentious, although I always point out that that about 80% of Canadians don't want us to increase immigration levels further, although the left does. And this is because people have, not because they're xenophobic, but because they have a practical sense of the limits of our capacity to integrate people. But I spent much of my 5 years as Minister of Immigration reinforcing the integrity of the system, just as John's government did, combating human smuggling and human trafficking and fake asylum claims and the inability to remove foreign criminals, and all of those issues helped to demonstrate to the public that we actually could and would control our borders, and that reinforced a sense of hospitality towards well-intentioned immigrants who wanted to integrate and contribute to the economy.
Toby, do you think there's much chance of David Cameron selling that message in Britain? I mean, for as long as we're a member of the EU, surely we can't control it, so by what Jason and John are saying, we're always going to have unpopular immigration.
I think it's proving incredibly difficult to control immigration, given that we're part of the European Union. I'm actually interested in what Jason Kenney and John Howard have to say about Dan Hannan's Anglosphere. I'm sure some of you have read his most recent book in which he talks about the emergence of the Anglosphere. And this, I think, is part of a larger narrative that Dan wants to use as part of an out campaign in a few years' time. It's not enough to just be against the European Union. We have to have an alternative to make Brexit attractive. We have to have something positive to sell in its place, and that thing is the Anglosphere. And he is advocating a closer relationship with the Commonwealth, trade links, immigration links, and so on and so forth, that somehow this could emerge as a political and attractive political and economic alternative to the EU. And I wondered what you, as leaders of two great Commonwealth countries, had to say about that.
Well, first of all, there actually is a lot of Anglosphere cooperation amongst those core 5 Anglosphere countries that people are not aware of. It happens organically and often off the radar screen. So one of the most effective intelligence sharing platforms in the world is the Five Eyes: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, who are very close in their cooperation and with respect to intelligence. Our national police forces have a very similar platform. Our attorneys general, ministers of justice meet annually, and officials meet frequently to share best practices on law reform. I did the same with immigration, and indeed we were constantly borrowing ideas from the Aussies and Kiwis on immigration reform and vice versa. So there is already a great deal of practical cooperation, but as Britain has chosen to tie itself to the EU with respect to trade policy, that limits, I mean, I find it sad in a way that we signed a free trade agreement with EFTA, with Liechtenstein and Norway, before we could with the United Kingdom through the Canada-European Union trade agreement. But that's the choice that you've made.
Look, I agree with that. The concept of the Anglosphere has a great emotional, historical and values-based appeal to people in those countries. And I'm all in favour of exploiting that. I'm all in favour of building on it. And Jason is absolutely correct when he says the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement is a priceless link. The most valuable weapon against terrorism is timely intelligence. And the intelligence cooperation between those countries is without parallel and extremely valuable. So I would say in relation to Daniel Hannan, I've talked to him about it and heard him speak on it, and he's very eloquent and compelling. By all means, where you can do that. But there are obvious constraints. And we're reminded this morning that Britain cannot make a trade agreement with a country on its own anymore because it's part of the European Union. I mean, that's a decision your country has taken, and it's not for me to say it was right or wrong, but it's a reality. I mean, we have signed a trade agreement with the United States, we signed a trade agreement with Thailand, and it goes on and on and on. And we're negotiating a trade agreement with China, not that it really matters very much in the long run because China is our best customer now. We're negotiating one with Japan. So, look, there is potential to build, but we've also got to understand there are limits. I mean, in 1950, Britain took 40% of Australia's trade. By 1972, that had declined to 11%. And in that period of time, Japan passed Britain, I think in 1967, to become our major export destination. Now, nothing is going to really alter that because of the complementarity. We've got the resources, North Asia has the demand. But at the margins, there are ways in which you can build on the Anglosphere. And the final thing I say about it is that my experience in political life is that the links that bind nations together more tightly than anything else are common values. The fact that compared with 1950, Britain is way down the list of our export destinations doesn't alter the fact that the common values between Britain and Australia keep those two countries very close together. So we have to keep a sense of perspective and balance when we're talking about that.
Right. Well, we're almost out of time, but there's one last question that I couldn't resist putting to you, John. It's that you will have seen over the years lots of strategies developed by Conservative parties around the Anglosphere. In your experience, what is the most common bad idea that Conservatives have?
Well, the most common bad idea that Conservatives have is that the way to win office is to pretend you're not too different from your opponents. The thing that I liked most ever being said critically of me was, I can't stand John Howard, but at least I know what he stands for. And I think it is very important. And can I just have a final burst on something that has really come out of this discussion? That in this whole debate about who's won and who's lost, we've got to remember that the debates are so much about the language you use. Now, I heard Toby talk very eloquently and passionately, and I agreed with everything he said about why don't we attack the left when they ignore the maltreatment of women in many Islamic countries. Why are they silent? Why are they allowed to get away with silence? One of the problems we have is with a word that's always bugged me, and it's bugged me for a long time, and the word is multiculturalism.
It's in Jason's job title.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry about this, but don't be offended.
Apologise.
No, I won't apologise for that. But let me explain. I am a multiracialist, but I'm not a multiculturalist. I think the idea that a country can seriously be multicultural is ridiculous. Every nation has a host culture. The host culture of Canada is, depending on where you live, a combination of what you might call loosely Anglo-Canadian or French-Canadian. And that's a long part of that nation's history. We have a host culture. It's predominantly of British and Irish origin, but has been changed over the years with successive migration, and that's fair enough. But this idea that you're going to have... I mean, I've never met a multicultural person. I've met a bicultural person, but I've never met a multicultural person. I think it's a contradiction in terms. So I think we get ourselves into terrible trouble with this expression. And what has happened is that the professional multiculturalists have conflated multiculturalism with multiracialism. And they use the word multicultural whenever anybody says anything that vaguely in defence of the host culture of a country. Say, oh, you're racist, you should be a multicultural. No, you're not. The ethnic origin of somebody is immaterial and should never be the subject of discrimination, prejudice or bigotry. But what should be understood is that people come to a country because of what that country is, not because of what they think it ought to become. And that is why, in my view, that is, I've had a bug about this word for a long time. I got into a lot of trouble on the subject when I was Prime Minister, but my views have not altered. I think it's a description that should probably slowly disappear from our terminology, but I don't think it will.
Well, I cannot let this session go without asking Jason, why did your Prime Minister give you the title Minister for Multiculturalism?
The term is in our Constitution.
Yeah.
And it was Conservatives who actually introduced it into our public discourse 30, 40 years ago. So allow me to defend myself by saying, first of all, John, that it's not so much Anglo-Canadian as Fraser would like to know, it's Scots-Canadian is really the normative historical identity in Canada. Indeed. Look, I agree with John in this, that the term multiculturalism is problematic, and it's problematic in part because it's equivocal. It means many different things to different people. And what it means to most Canadians, about 80% of Canadians consistently in polls express support for the concept of multiculturalism. By the way, supermajorities of the same people say that they believe that newcomers have a duty to integrate, to respect Canada's values, customs, culture, law, and so forth. So there's a kind of tension in that. But what most Canadians understand multiculturalism to mean is a benign kind of folkloric multiculturalism that sort of allows people the space to celebrate what's best about their own particular culture or faith background. But it is decidedly not in the Canadian context the kind of Frankfurt School Marxism that you have in continental Europe and amongst some in the intellectual left in Britain who use this term as a justification for cultural relativism. And Canadians, including the vast majority of new Canadians, denounce that version of multiculturalism. So in our context, it's kind of a benign version of pluralism that we inherited from the British imperial presence in Canada. And the last point is, that is hardwired into our political DNA. When the British decided to invite the French Canadians following the conquest in the 1750s to retain their French language, their Catholic religion, their civil law, and their own traditions. And that largely also characterized, at best, our relationship with our Aboriginal people. That created an approach to accommodation towards unity and diversity that really we try to apply to our newcomers today. It's not a license to disrespect or fight against the historical norm in Canada. It's an invitation to pursue a kind of unity and diversity in a relaxed way.
Thank you, Jason. So the Scots and Nova Scotia are safe. Well, thank you to all our panel. It's been a great session. It could go on forever, but we're over time. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
I apologise.
No, don't apologise.
Scots Canadian.